The city had just slipped into autumn when the air turned sharper, leaves rustled like whispers underfoot, and the rain seemed determined to paint every street with silver light. It was on one such evening, when the sky pressed low and the wind tugged at coats, that their paths crossed. Amelia Hart was a young woman of 28, her life carefully measured in deadlines and quiet rituals. She had built a career as a restorer of old paintings, spending long hours in a small studio filled with the smell of varnish, oil pigments, and forgotten stories hidden under cracked surfaces. Though her hands worked with devotion, her heart carried a weight of solitude. She had long stopped expecting love to enter her world, telling herself she was content with quiet independence. Yet there was always a faint ache she could not explain. On nights when the city softened into silence, she would stand by her window and imagine someone's shadow beside her, the warmth of another life touching hers. But these dreams always dissolved into the hum of the streets below. That evening, the rain caught her unprepared. She stood under the awning of a small bookstore, clutching her bag close, watching the downpour turn the cobblestones into a river of light. The glass of the shop's window reflected her pale face, her dark hair falling loose from a hurried knot, her eyes carrying that quiet distance of someone half absent from the world around her. Across the street, a man hurried toward the same shelter, his coat already damp, his stride long and determined. His name was Adrian Clark, 32, an architect whose life was a constant dance between precision and imagination. Buildings were his language, lines and spaces his poetry. Yet for all his success, he felt a hollowness that no design could fill. He had buried himself in work, convincing himself that love was a distraction best left untouched, though in truth, it was fear that kept him alone. Fear of being disappointed, of offering his heart only to watch it fracture. The rain pulled them together like a silent conductor arranging the notes of a melody. Adrian reached the awning just as Amelia shifted to make space, their shoulders almost brushing. The world seemed to pause, the roar of the rain fading into the background. For a moment, neither of them noticed the storm, only the nearness of another soul carrying the same quiet loneliness. There was no introduction, no words exchanged, only the shared silence of strangers who, unknowingly, had stepped onto the first page of a story larger than themselves. The rain became their witness, the city their stage, and the air between them stirred with something neither could yet name. That night, when Amelia returned home, she carried with her the strange sensation of having been seen, though no words had passed. Adrian, too, found himself distracted, the image of a woman with thoughtful eyes lingering even as he drafted blueprints late into the night. Neither knew it yet, but the rain had written the first line of a love story that would test their fears, heal their wounds, and teach them the language of hope once more. The city slept under the silver wash of rain, unaware of the threads being woven. Two lives, long accustomed to silence, had brushed against one another, and though nothing had been spoken, the world had already begun to change. The days that followed drifted by with the same rhythm as before, work, streets, and quiet evenings, but both Amelia and Adrian carried an unshakable sense that something had shifted. It was as if the rain had left not just puddles on the ground, but also a faint imprint on their hearts. Amelia buried herself in the delicate task of restoring a 17th-century canvas, its surface fragile, worn by centuries of time. She worked under the golden light of her studio lamp, each brushstroke careful, each movement a small act of patience. Yet her concentration fractured more often than she admitted. Behind her thoughts stood the fleeting image of the man in the rain, the way he had arrived at the exact moment she had felt most exposed, the quiet recognition in his presence, as though he carried an echo of her own solitude. Her friends, few but loyal, had long teased her about the invisible walls she built around her heart. And perhaps they were right. Amelia had learned, through a series of small heartbreaks, that not everyone who reached for her hand would hold it with care. She had once given her heart too freely and had paid for it with silence and distance that never fully healed. Since then, she had trained herself to believe in independence. Yet the memory of a stranger's nearness lingered stubbornly, whispering of something she had sworn not to seek. Adrian, meanwhile, returned to his world of blueprints and construction sites. By day, he presented models to clients, his voice steady and persuasive, his gestures precise. By night, he stared at half-finished sketches, his thoughts drifting. He remembered the shadow of a woman under the awning, her gaze turned toward the rain, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. That quietness had struck him, not emptiness, but a depth that mirrored his own unspoken yearning. Adrian's life, too, bore the scars of the past. Years ago, he had loved once, deeply, recklessly. But dreams of marriage and shared futures had crumbled when betrayal left him standing in ruins. Since then, he had sworn never to build anything fragile again, not in stone, not in love. It was easier to hide behind work, where precision promised safety. Yet memory betrayed him. When he closed his eyes, the rain returned, and with it the ghost of a woman whose name he did not know. And so, they walked their separate streets, two lives running parallel, unaware of how swiftly the city would conspire to bring them together again. The turning point came quietly. On a crisp afternoon, Amelia wandered into the very bookstore that had sheltered her from a storm. She came searching for a volume on Renaissance pigments, but what she found instead was Adrian, standing by the architecture section, a book half open in his hand. Their eyes met across the quiet shelves, and time seemed to fold back into that night of rain. It was no accident, though it seemed so. The city had drawn its lines carefully, guiding them to collide once more. And though neither spoke, both felt it. Destiny was no longer knocking softly. It was opening the door. Amelia left the store with the faintest tremor in her chest, a mixture of fear and wonder. Adrian remained a while longer, his mind restless with possibility. Neither admitted it yet, but the story had begun to gather weight, the silence between them rich with questions, the future stirring like an unwritten chapter waiting to be turned. Autumn deepened, painting the city in amber and rust, and though days passed with the usual demands of work and errands, something invisible had begun to weave itself between Amelia and Adrian. Their meetings, at first coincidental, soon grew into a quiet rhythm. At the cafe near the square, she would sometimes sit with a sketchbook open, sipping tea, unaware that he passed by on his way to the studio. At the bookstore, they crossed paths again, she at the art shelves, he at the architecture section, as if pulled by the same invisible magnet. Each encounter was brief, almost fragile, but it left behind a warmth that carried them through the hours that followed. For Amelia, the presence of Adrian stirred a part of her heart she had long sealed away. She felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease, as if the universe were urging her to step closer while her fears whispered warnings to retreat. For Adrian, the sight of her reminded him of a forgotten truth, that connection could arrive not as thunder, but as a gentle thread, unannounced and persistent. Yet neither dared to speak. Their silences became their language. A glance held longer than needed, the faint smile when eyes met across a crowded street, the awareness of standing near yet not touching. It was in those wordless exchanges that trust quietly began to take root. Still, shadows of the past loomed. Amelia's heart recoiled from risk. She knew, too, well, the sharp edges of disappointment. She told herself that these coincidences were nothing more than fleeting moments, soon to dissolve. Yet, when she returned to her empty apartment at night, she found herself listening for echoes of footsteps she wished were beside hers. Adrian, too, wrestled with hesitation. The part of him that longed to draw near was constantly silenced by the echo of betrayal that had once shattered his certainty. He had sworn to himself that he would never step into such vulnerability again. But with every accidental meeting, that oath grew weaker, until it was little more than a whisper drowned out by the quiet insistence of fate. It was on a late afternoon, as the sky folded into dusky shades of violet, that something shifted. Amelia lingered at the riverside, sketching the bridge arches gilded by sunset. Adrian happened to pass, his stride slowing, drawn by the sight of her absorbed in her work. He did not speak, and she did not look up, but the silence between them swelled with meaning. In that moment, it became clear what bound them was not mere chance. It was the beginning of a thread, fragile, invisible, yet unbreakable, that would pull them closer, whether they chose to follow it or not. The river carried its reflections into the night, and the city lights flickered awake. Two souls, still hesitant, still silent, stood at the threshold of something that neither fully understood. What had started as coincidence was becoming a story, and the first chapter had quietly closed, promising another just beyond the horizon. Winter crept into the city with quiet persistence. The air grew sharper, the mornings turned pale with frost, and the evenings carried the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Life slowed, yet for Amelia and Adrian, the unspoken thread between them only tightened, drawing them into a quiet orbit neither dared to resist. Their meetings continued, sometimes by chance, sometimes as if orchestrated by something beyond chance. A shared glance across the street, a silent acknowledgement in a familiar cafe, the faint recognition of presence in the same room. With each encounter, their silence grew heavier, carrying the weight of words unsaid, of emotions waiting for permission to breathe. But silence, though gentle, is never without consequence. Both carried within them the quiet wars of fear and desire. For Amelia, the approach of winter mirrored the landscape of her heart. She remembered how cold love could become when it was abandoned, how trust could turn brittle when left unguarded. And so, each time she felt herself drawn to Adrian, she pulled away inside, convincing herself that she must remain untouchable, safe behind the walls she had so carefully built. For Adrian, the struggle was different, but no less consuming. The architect who could command the strength of stone and steel could not command the fragility of his own longing. He wanted to step forward, to reach out, to ask her name, to place himself into her story, but each memory of betrayal held him back, a chain forged from wounds not yet fully healed. And so, though they stood nearer than ever, a distance remained, one not measured by streets or bridges, but by the cautious silence of two hearts afraid of repeating old mistakes. Yet the city itself seemed unwilling to let them drift apart. One evening, a gallery announced the opening of an exhibition, masterpieces restored, paintings reborn from the decay of time. Amelia's work had been chosen to stand among them, though few knew the restorer's name. She attended quietly, dressed with understated elegance, her presence unnoticed by most. Adrian entered the gallery the same night, drawn by curiosity and habit. As he wandered through halls filled with color and light, his gaze fell upon a canvas that seemed alive again after centuries of silence. He lingered there, unaware that just steps away, the woman who had restored it stood, watching her creation breathe once more. The irony of the moment was delicate and cruel. Two souls who longed for closeness stood side by side, yet neither dared to break the silence. They shared the same air, the same beauty, the same heartbeat of wonder, yet the distance within them held firm. But fate has a way of weaving threads tighter when they threaten to unravel. That night, though they left the gallery without a word, both carried with them the undeniable truth. Their lives were no longer moving in solitude. Something fragile, persistent, unstoppable was pulling them closer to the edge of a revelation. Winter deepened, and with it, the distance between them trembled, waiting for the moment it would finally collapse. The new year arrived quietly, with snow blanketing the city in silence. Streets glistened under lamplight, and the air was filled with the muted hush of winter. To Amelia, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Yet inside her, the old conflict raged stronger than ever, her longing for connection and her fear of loss wrestling with each other in endless circles. She found herself wandering the familiar streets more often, passing the bookstore, pausing at the cafe, walking by the river where she had once sketched the arches of the bridge. She told herself she was there only by habit, but deep within she knew she was searching for a shadow, a face, a silent presence she had come to crave more than she dared admit. Adrian, too, felt the pull. His days at the firm grew heavy, his nights restless. Drafts of buildings filled his desk, yet his thoughts escaped into patterns of another kind, the curve of a hand sketching lines on paper, the stillness of a woman watching the rain. He told himself he was foolish, that these were nothing but fragments of chance encounters. Yet he knew the truth. He was no longer the man content with solitude. Something inside him had awakened, and it refused to be silenced. And then the moment came, not grand, not orchestrated, but simple and raw. A sudden snowstorm swept through the city, catching everyone off guard. Amelia, leaving her studio late, was trapped in the swirling white, her footsteps vanishing as quickly as they were made. She struggled against the wind, her coat pulled tight, when at once, through the haze of snow, she saw him. Adrian, crossing the same square, lifted his head at the same instant. For a breathless moment, the storm was forgotten. They stood facing each other, two figures in the whiteness, as if the world had stripped itself down to nothing but them. The distance that had haunted them collapsed in that instant, not with words, not with touch, but with the sheer inevitability of recognition. All the silent meetings, all the hesitations, all the fears, they converged into one undeniable truth. They had been searching for each other, even when they pretended otherwise. Amelia felt her heart surge against the wall she had built, and for the first time in years, she did not hold it back. Adrian felt the weight of betrayal lift like snow from a branch, replaced by something fragile but real, hope. The storm raged around them, but inside that moment, there was only stillness. Two lives that had walked alone for so long had finally met at the center of their solitude. It was not the end of the story, only the breaking point, the place where silence ended and the promise of something greater began. The snowstorm passed by morning, leaving the city hushed and sparkling under a pale golden sky. Amelia awoke with the memory of last night pressed against her chest like a secret she dared not lose. For the first time in years, she felt lighter, no longer drifting, no longer trapped in the shadows of old wounds. Adrian, too, rose to a world transformed. The city was the same, yet he saw it differently now, every detail sharp, alive, infused with a quiet promise. He no longer carried the burden of silence alone. He carried the spark of what had begun in the storm. They met again, not by chance this time, but by choice. At the river's edge, where ice had begun to crack in its shifting plates, Adrian waited. Amelia approached slowly, her scarf pulled tight, her breath visible in the cold. For a moment, they simply stood there, each uncertain of how to begin. But then Amelia, with a trembling courage she never thought she possessed, spoke first. "I'm tired of walking past my life," she said softly, her eyes fixed on him. "I don't want to keep pretending I don't see what's right in front of me." Adrian stepped closer, the frost crunching beneath his boots. His voice was low but steady. "Neither do I. I've been afraid for too long. But last night showed me something. It showed me that losing this would be worse than any fear." The walls between them dissolved, not with grand gestures, but with honesty, bare, fragile, and real. Adrian reached out, and Amelia, after only a heartbeat of hesitation, placed her hand in his. The warmth startled them both in its simplicity. From that day forward, their lives did not become perfect. There were still scars, still memories, still uncertainties. But perfection was never what they had been seeking. What they found instead was presence. Morning coffee shared without silence. Long walks where words finally filled the spaces. Evenings of laughter that felt almost like healing. Adrian no longer measured life in drafts and deadlines. He measured it in moments, small, ordinary, luminous. Amelia's sketches grew bolder, her pages no longer haunted by emptiness but alive with color and shape. And though the city kept moving, indifferent as ever, for them the world had shifted. What began as fleeting glances and unsaid words had grown into something that neither storm nor silence could undo. It was not a fairy tale ending, but it was something far rarer, two souls who had walked alone for too long, finally walking forward together.